Hey everyone, Jeff Dorman here again for another edition of That's Our Two Satoshis Live. And today I am joined by ARCA NFT analyst and a heck of a pickleball player, Topher McPherson. How you doing, pal?
Hey Jeff, how you doing?
I'm good. If it ever gets warm enough here in LA, we'll go out and play some pickleball. But
All
as
in.
always, for the folks who are just tuning in here, we like to talk about the markets. We've been doing it for 5 years now. We write a blog every week on our website, ar.ca/blog, called That's Our Two Satoshis. We talk about what's happening in the digital asset market, and we come and talk to you guys about it on Tuesday and get some insights into where we're headed in the market, what's happening. Before we get started, as always, quick disclaimer, this commentary is not intended to be investment advice, investment research, or a recommendation. Please consult your investment professional for your own circumstances. All right, Topher, a couple things going on before we get into the wild world of NFTs. Last week, not the best week for digital assets, down, let's say the majors down 3-4%, some of the smaller caps down anywhere from 8 to 12%. But what's probably most interesting was that this happened during a week when the S&P was up, oil was up, gold was up, pretty much every other risk asset was up. It was pretty much a reversal of the week before, where the opposite was true, where digital assets were higher and all the macro assets were down. And I think, again, we've been on the camp for a long time. Those who listen to us and read us know that we think macro really hasn't been driving the bus in crypto really for 9 months. Since the first half of last year. But this was, these last couple of weeks have been even more evidence showing that digital assets are really, for the most part, trading in their own world right now, largely driven by idiosyncratic factors. And I think there's 3 real reasons for that before we get into kind of NFTs, although my answers will dovetail into that. There's 3 real reasons why, macro is just another passenger on the bus now instead of driving the bus. The first is that, and even today you saw it with Powell speaking, is that 2022 was an anomaly, right? We went into 2022 thinking we were going to have 3 rate hikes. We, meaning the market, was assuming 3 rate hikes, about 25 basis points each, for a total of 75 bips. What actually happened, of course, was 4 consecutive 75 basis point rate hikes after the first 25 and 50, followed by another 50 and 25. So we're talking about a multiple standard deviation away from what the expectations were. And you contrast that with today, and it's like, okay, we know we're close to done. Whether it's another 20, whether it's 3 more 25s or 2 25s and a 50, the delta in terms of expectations versus what's actually going to happen is just not high enough to matter anymore. Number 2 is that there's been so many unique positive and negative events happening in the digital asset space. You can go back to May, June of last year with Luna and UST. And all the bankruptcies that triggered, from Celsius to Voyager. Then you had the positive side, you had the ETH merge. Then, of course, back in November, you had the negative again with FTX and BlockFi and Genesis and now Silvergate. And, of course, the war on digital assets from regulators, especially here in the U.S. And also things that we're about to talk about, like Bitcoin getting a new narrative with NFTs and Ordinals. So you have just a lot going on in the digital asset space that is far more interesting than whether or not the Fed decides to go 25 or 50 at their next meeting. And finally, number 3, and I think this is probably more important than most people will lead on, is that a big reason for the decline in digital assets last year was because what was once seen as an uncorrelated market became very correlated, and that turned a lot of people off. Right, once Bitcoin and ETH were just tracking the Nasdaq, kind of lost its luster in terms of being this new uncorrelated asset class. But the reality is correlations often have less to do with the assets themselves and more to do with the players who are trading those assets. And 2 of the biggest correlation traders, meaning Alameda and FTX, as well as 3 Arrows, are gonzo, right? They're out of the market, right? Those are the ones who were, hedging their crypto with the Nasdaq over and over and over again. And when they left the market, as well as a lot of other big kind of macro funds, correlations go away. And that's what we've seen over the last, like I said, 9 months, but specifically this year, where, again, we're just trading in our own world, independent of what is happening with the macro. So I think those are 3 pretty big reasons for this divergence. I think we'll continue to see that the rest of the year, both for good and for bad. But more importantly, let's talk about what is going on with Bitcoin, what's going on with NFTs, what's going on with Yuga Labs. Is this as big of a story as maybe I think it is and maybe some others is, or is this sort of a non-story? So why don't we start kind of high level, Topher? What's your take on what's going on with Bitcoin, with Ordinals, and specifically the Yuga launch this past weekend?
Yeah, I mean, I think like what you said, Bitcoin has been looking for a catalyst for a number of months, to say the least. And I think that Ordinals, is posing, kind of something interesting for the first time in a long time for Bitcoin. Obviously, just from the user base alone, it's interesting. The amount of people that could be onboarded to this. I think right now Ordinals exist kind of as novelties. The infrastructure just doesn't exist yet. For Ordinals, it's highly technical. I mean, even people that I'm talking to who have been in the space 5-10 years, it takes them even some research themselves just to get set up to work with a Bitcoin wallet that's Taproot enabled and therefore accessible with these Ordinals, NFTs, whatever you want to call them. But I do think in the future, we'll see NFT projects that more resemble what we see on Ethereum, where it's not just a picture. There's a larger ecosystem. There's a larger narrative. You're really building a brand and an organization rather than just inscribing a picture of art for people to speculate on. And that's the one thing with the Yuga Labs Ordinals mint here. They've made it very clear that this project is not going to be like Ordate or their other projects and not related at all to these other projects. And so they've made it pretty clear that this is just art. And I do think down the line...
Do people care about that? I mean, part of the reason for the NFT explosion in 2021 was that it was fun and that it was easy, right? It was super easy to trade on OpenSea. It was fun to see what the next collection was going to be, or start to envision other areas of the IP that could take off, or community members. Fun and easy is pretty important, and it doesn't sound like from your description that this is fun or easy so far on Bitcoin.
Certainly not easy. I think for people who really love Bitcoin, this is something that they're having fun with. They're experimenting with. I think for them, it's fun pushing the boundaries on a protocol that basically is meant to be non-moving. Right?
Fun for developers and project creators, but what about for the end user who would ultimately buy and utilize these?
True. I mean, it still comes with the community aspect, which is, a reason why, a lot of people buy NFTs and have kind of fun and enjoy them. But you're right. I mean, to the point, there's not much substance yet, I guess, right? There's no utility to these projects. But I do hope in the future, and I think Yuga will be one of the first to put out a project that does kind of push these boundaries once that infrastructure is there to do so.
Okay. So explain some of the bigger differences, though, for those who maybe haven't been able to dive into this themselves, right? You own an NFT on Ethereum or Solana, and it's non-fungible token. It's basically a one of multiple collection, or it's a one of one, but it's it's a unique asset that can be sent and received on its own. Whereas with Bitcoin, you're talking about this is one Satoshi, right? The smallest movable piece of a Bitcoin. Is it possible that can is it always new blocks that are including these new inscriptions? Can you go back and change an old Bitcoin? Like, could somebody end up with a wallet that just has a Bitcoin in it that or has some Bitcoin in it, some Satoshis in it that have something inscribed on them? Like, mechanically, how will this work when you have this use case of Bitcoin and now it's sort of just attached to it, versus something like Ethereum where it's a completely separate asset? I don't know if I'm describing it correctly, but I think you know where I'm getting at.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, on Ethereum, NFTs have their own token standard. And so basically what that allows them to do is to interact with the different smart contracts that Ethereum has, which of course has, kind of unleashed all of these use cases and utility. And like what you mentioned for Bitcoin, when these Satoshis are inscribed, it's just one single Satoshi that will be sitting in your wallet, potentially indiscernible against your other Bitcoin, right? And so it's possible if you have an inscription sitting in your wallet, and if you want to send a Bitcoin to a buddy, you might actually accidentally send out that Satoshi, which is inscribed. So that just kind of goes back to this point of the infrastructure is not there just yet. That shouldn't be a thing if you want this to be large scale. But I think there are many developers that are rushing to this. I mean, even last week we saw one of the first marketplaces pop up. There are projects like Stacks, which are trying to create kind of a layer 2 with Bitcoin and work with Ordinals that way. So it's just basically, unfortunately, it's not there yet, but it certainly has a lot of potential in the long run.
Yeah, I mean, I think you know me. I like to draw analogies and parallels to kind of think about this. I think obviously Bitcoin hasn't fully fulfilled the narrative of what it was supposed to be, right? It certainly has acted as hard money. It hasn't really acted as an inflation hedge. It hasn't really acted as a medium of exchange. But if it were ever to reach that, then you get into this interesting thing, which is, imagine if you had, I don't know, well, imagine if you had $100 bills. And, we think of them as completely fungible. They're the same. It doesn't matter. But obviously every, bill has a serial number, has a number on there that's unique. If you had $100 bills and, somebody said, just be careful, one of them might have, a serial number that's actually worth $2 million.
Right.
That'd be kind of weird, right? I mean, all of a sudden it would change the way that you think about money. If, your $1 bills or your $5 bills or your $100 bills were suddenly worth more or less than what they say they're worth. Is that a risk, in your opinion, with Bitcoin ordinals, that it changes the fungibility characteristics of what Bitcoin is supposed to be as a medium of exchange?
I don't think so. Just the sheer number of these, at least thus far, the impact is really low. Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think it's difficult to answer until we see how popular this becomes. Because if Ordinals becomes more popular, then it opens up the idea of, well, what the hell else can we do on Bitcoin that we never thought of before? And does it have to happen at the Satoshi level versus some other, kind of technological fix that can make this more usable? So difficult for me to answer, I guess.
Well, we'll get back to you when it's less difficult. But so let's talk about Yuga specifically, right? There was an auction last week. Yuga, obviously a household name now, certainly in the Ethereum NFT community because of the success of Bored Apes and all the different Mutant Apes and Kennel Club, as well as some of the ones that they've purchased or rather tucked into their fleet, like Meebits and others. What is this? Is this just a money grab? Is Yuga just saying, hey, we're the biggest brand in NFTs, so let's go throw something out there on Bitcoin just to make sure that we're, become the leader there too? Or is there more to it? How is this being received? What's your thoughts? Anything from this, auction itself?
Yeah, I mean, I think the skeptic's point of view is that, that this is, just an easy way for them to raise. I believe through the auction, they raised $16.5 million. That's a very skeptical way of looking at it. Another opinion that we've seen out there is that this is what happens when NFT marketplaces get rid of royalties. Now these projects have to come out with new projects that dilute, kind of the original value. In my opinion, I see nothing wrong with Yuga doing this. I think that anything pushing the NFT space forward, it makes sense for Yuga to be a first mover there. I think basically, it goes along with what we've been discussing, that I think Yuga wanted to be one of the first to establish a presence on Ordinals so that in the future, once the infrastructure is better, they'll be the first to release an NFT project that really does something, right? And it's something to get very excited about.
Okay. And the auction's done, right? There was just under 300 of these NFTs that were minted. It was a weird auction style with people paying different prices across the board, which is a little strange. Are they trading? Is there a secondary market for these anywhere?
They're not trading yet. They actually haven't even been inscribed on the network yet. That will be done in the next 7 days. They'll inscribe them and then distribute them out to the people who won the auction. But yeah, like what you said, the auction was a bit non-conventional. The lowest bid that was accepted was 2.3 Bitcoin versus the highest bid, which is over 7 Bitcoin. So not sure if that person didn't read the rules or made a typo, but he ended up paying about 5 Bitcoin over over the cost basis of others. So it's a strange auction style in NFTs. When there's an auction, it's usually Dutch auction. So price slowly comes down until bidders step in. But yeah, that is how the auction went down here. So we're excited to see what happens once it starts trading on the secondary market in the next week.
Okay, so compared to some of the other things you're seeing in the Ethereum and maybe Solana world, some of the things that you're excited about that we're investing in at Arca, where does this rank? Is this super exciting, medium exciting, not that exciting? What's your initial kind of sense of where we're headed with Bitcoin NFTs?
Yeah, I think medium excitement. Although we can say that a lot of infrastructure is being built, that doesn't mean that those solutions are going to be adequate to make these things trade in a manner that Ethereum NFTs trade. But down the line, I do think that you're working with the largest user base in crypto, and people who are already so ingrained in this community. It would just make sense to have inscriptions be kind of an extension of this community, kind of like how PFPs are for Ethereum users.
Yeah. Okay. Well, outside of just JPEGs and pictures, we'll leave on this. What's the most exciting thing? Give me one or two things that is exciting to you right now in the NFT market, as we obviously have already turned the corner from 2022, independent of prices and some of the collections themselves, which are down. What's exciting you right now? What do you think is something that everyone watching this today should be looking into in the NFT world?
Yeah, I think it's in 2023, most excited about Web3 gaming. A use case that started with Axie Infinity, but is now being altered. Basically to become more mainstream. They're taking these games from being turn-based kind of card games to being full-out AAA titles, and I think that there's a lot of work being done on tokenomics. We talk with teams all the time, and every team has a different take on how to figure out this Web3 gaming puzzle, which of course involves NFTs. So I think we're going to see a lot of releases, at least of betas this year, that will certainly put some of these theories to the test, at least, and could really kind of bring some of these ideas and theories that we've had about Web3 gaming and finally bring them to production and see how they hold up.
Awesome. Well, we'll look forward to having you back when we have some of these games live and see how they start to perform. Awesome. All right, guys. Well, that's it for this week. Appreciate everyone tuning in. Again, you can check out the blog on our website, ar.ca/blog, if you want to read Topher's thoughts in more depth on Bitcoin Ordinals and Yuga Labs. Otherwise, we will be back again next week. That's our 2 Satoshis, and we'll see you next week, guys. Thank you.